As the iron gates of Bañeto prison opened on a warm afternoon in 2011, a man stepped through, squinting into the bright Cuban sun. His body bore the scars of his captivity, beatings, solitary confinement, psychological torture. Now he tasted freedom for the first time in 8 years, but freedom had come with a catch. The Cuban government had offered him and other political prisoners a deal, freedom in exchange for exile. Most had accepted. As he stood at the crossroads, his mind raced. How could he abandon the country he had fought for? He thought of the women in white who had risked their lives to free him. He knew that leaving would mean their fight was in vain, and yet staying in Cuba meant facing persecution and rearrest. He thought of his wife and young children. Would he see them grow up if he stayed? At that moment, José Daniel Ferrer made a choice that would strike fear into Cuba's leaders for years to come. Ferrer's journey began in Santiago de Cuba. As a young adult in the 90s, Ferrer experienced the harsh realities of Cuba's special period following the Soviet Union's collapse. He'd rise before dawn to stand in long lines for meager rations and navigate pitch-black streets during frequent blackouts. He heard the whispers of discontent as his father held forbidden meetings in his home, and he began to dream about reshaping his country's future. At age 27, Ferrer decided to risk everything for change. He joined the Christian Liberation Movement, or MCL. The MCL fought for democracy in Cuba, a goal the government saw as a threat. Ferrer went door to door, talking to neighbors about human rights, knowing every knock could mean arrest. He shared banned books, including the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and he watched as fellow members were harassed and imprisoned. He knew he could be next, and yet he persisted. The Cuban government had tolerated little dissent since Fidel Castro's communist revolution overthrew the Batista government in 1959. Now, faced with a growing democracy movement, the regime cracked down hard. In March 2003, Ferrer was jolted awake as a swarm of state security agents bashed in his door and took him by force. That night, Cuban authorities arrested 74 other dissidents in what became known as the Black Spring. Ferrer was accused of being a paid mercenary for the U.S. and trying to destabilize the communist regime. For Ferrer, it marked the beginning of a long nightmare. After a sham trial lasting only hours, with no chance to mount a proper defense, Ferrer received a brutal 25-year sentence. Life in Bañeto prison tested Ferrer's resolve daily. Conditions were brutal, with overcrowded cells barely large enough to stretch out in. The food was inadequate, the medical care limited. Political prisoners like Ferrer faced extra hardships, including frequent solitary confinement and denied family visits. Yet Ferrer refused to be silenced. He organized hunger strikes to protest prison conditions, his stomach aching but his will unbroken. He smuggled out letters detailing human rights abuses, risking his life with every word. And he spoke about democracy and freedom to anyone who would listen, even his guards. One harrowing incident in 2006 showed the depths of the regime's cruelty. After protesting a fellow prisoner's mistreatment, guards threw Ferrer into the hole. This punishment cell was barely large enough to lie down in, with no light and stifling heat. For 12 long days, Ferrer endured this torture. The darkness was absolute, the air thick and suffocating, but in that tiny space, Ferrer's resolve grew. As word of Ferrer's imprisonment spread, international pressure on the Cuban government grew. Human rights groups, foreign leaders, and Cuban exile communities all demanded the release of the Group of 75. The Catholic Church played a key role, negotiating the group's freedom through talks with the Cuban government. And as Ferrer endured his imprisonment, another powerful movement emerged outside the prison walls. Laura Poyan, whose husband was also in prison, organized the Damas de Blanca, or Ladies in White, bringing together wives and relatives of the jailed activists. Every Sunday, they staged silent marches through Havana's colorful streets, demanding freedom for their loved ones. Their stark white clothes became a striking symbol, a constant reminder of the price of dissent in Cuba. Facing mounting global pressure, Cuban leaders eventually caved, agreeing to release the prisoners. In March 2011, José Daniel Ferrer walked free. After 8 grueling years behind bars, where he witnessed unimaginable suffering, he chose to stay and fight. But his next move would prove even more dangerous. Just after Ferrer walked free, Laura Poyan's fight for justice took a tragic turn. During a peaceful protest, state security agents violently attacked her and other ladies in white. Poyan was beaten and suffered severe injuries. She was hospitalized shortly after with respiratory issues, but died suddenly in October of 2011. The government said she died of a heart attack, but her family maintains the beating led to her death. The ladies in white remain active to this day. Boyan's tragic death steeled Ferrer's resolve. Determined to avenge her and bring freedom to Cuba, he founded the Patriotic Union of Cuba, or UNPACU. This organization quickly became one of the largest and most active opposition groups on the island, and put him on a collision course with the Cuban regime. Under Ferrer's leadership, UNPACU employed bold tactics. They organized public demonstrations that were strictly forbidden. They distributed flash drives and DVDs filled with uncensored news about democracy and human rights, creating an underground network of information. They filmed evidence of human rights abuses and posted them on social media. As their numbers grew, the government began to fear Ferrer's influence. UNPACU members faced constant harassment, arrests, and beatings. In 2018, UNPACU launched its boldest campaign yet. The One Cuban, One Vote initiative gathered signatures demanding free, multi-party elections. The petition drive spread quickly across the island, alarming authorities. Ferrer crisscrossed Cuba to promote the campaign and was detained multiple times. Despite his arrest, Ferrer gathered 10,000 signatures. He valiantly attempted to deliver the petitions to the National Assembly in Havana. He was arrested before reaching the building, but the message was clear. The desire for democratic change was growing. But the communist regime's repression was getting worse. When Miguel Díaz-Canel succeeded Raúl Castro as president in 2018, controls on dissent tightened. The stage was set for a showdown. In October 2019, armed Cuban state security officers again stormed into Ferrer's home, dragging him away in front of his family. For weeks, no one knew where he was. The government accused him of assault and damaging state property. The accusations were vague, and many believed they were fabricated to silence him. When finally brought to trial, Ferrer showed signs of torture and malnutrition, his face bearing the marks of abuse. Despite lack of evidence and international condemnation, Ferrer received a sentence of 4.5 years of house arrest. But even under house arrest, Ferrer's spirit remained unbroken. Using social media and secret communications, he coordinated protests and continued to speak out against government abuses. Supporters risked arrest to visit, turning his house into a hub of resistance. Ferrer's unwavering commitment during this time inspired a new generation of Cuban activists. The true impact of Ferrer's work became clear on July 11, 2021. On that sweltering summer day, unprecedented protests erupted across Cuba. Inspired by Ferrer's work, tens of thousands of Cubans took to the streets, their voices rising in a chorus demanding freedom and an end to the communist system. It was a powerful vindication of his years of struggle. Despite being under house arrest, Ferrer couldn't stay at home while his fellow Cubans demanded their freedom. Risking everything, he and his son drove to Santiago to support the movement, but Cuban authorities had been watching. State security stopped their car, and Ferrer's son watched in horror as his father was thrown into a police vehicle. José Daniel Ferrer has been held in solitary confinement under severe conditions ever since. His health has deteriorated significantly, and he is denied regular access to his family and medical care. Just weeks ago, Ferrer was able to smuggle out a letter to his family. He said the Cuban dictatorship is trying to, quote, bury me alive, but that he will die as a staunch defender of freedom, democracy, human rights, justice, and fundamental values. But as Ferrer endures unimaginable suffering, something has changed in Cuba. The fear that has kept Cubans silent for decades is beginning to crack. Ferrer's relentless bravery has sparked a movement as more Cubans find their voices and demand their freedom. If you enjoy inspirational stories of courageous men and women risking their lives for freedom, you will love the incredible journey of Dr. Meringue Baloche, and subscribe for more tales from the global fight for freedom.